Okay. Hello, everyone. We can see people joining. Thank you for joining us. You can say hello and tell us where you're joining us from in the chat if you'd like. Yeah, good to see some familiar names. So we'll wait a couple of minutes to allow for more people to join, and then we'll get started. Okay, I might get started with my introductory comments. So hello, everyone, and welcome to the 6th and final session of this year's EUC Seminar Series Aim High Degrow, Dialogues on Degrowth. We invite you, as always, to visit our website, and you can catch up on all of our sessions there. Today, on our last session, we're gonna delve into perhaps the topic we've received more questions on, which is, how do we transition to a degrowth future? What does that look like? What are the implications? And we're very, very excited to have with us Barbara Muraca, who is an associate professor of philosophy at the University of Oregon. Her research focuses on environmental and social philosophy, process philosophy, and political ecology. She was a lead author for the IPBES assessment on the multiple values of nature. We are also very excited to have Hubert Buch-Hansen, who is associate professor at Roskilde University in Denmark. Most of his recent work revolves around degrowth transformations, political economy, and critical realist philosophy. He's the author of several journal articles and books, including one that just came out called Deep Transformations, A Theory of Degrowth. And it's co-authored with Jana Nesterova and Max Koch, who some of you might remember we heard from on our last session. The session today will be moderated by my colleague Justin Podur, who is a professor at EUC. He focused his research on political conflict, namely wars, where the West has a heavy footprint and therefore has harmed developmental and environmental aspirations. Okay, so a couple of quick reminders before I pass on to Justin to kick off the session. The chat is open for comments and respectful dialogue, so do use it, but please don't write your questions there. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Once you type your questions there, you can also click on the thumbs up to upvote questions from others that interest you, and that will help Justin to prioritize certain questions during the discussion part, those that get more interest. The session is also currently being recorded and will be available on our website if you want to rewatch it or share with others. And we're also collecting notes from the chat and the Q&A, and all these notes and resources will be posted on the website as well. Okay, let's get started. So it's over to you, Justin.
All right, thank you so much. Thank you everyone for coming. Thank you, Lena, for organizing these sessions, and thank you to our guests and the audience. I'm going to start with a land acknowledgement. We remind you that York University is private. Oh, sorry, wrong panel. York University recognizes that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. York University acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area, now known as Toronto, has been taken care of by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. The territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. So that's the land acknowledgement for York. And And with that, I believe we can turn it over to our guests, our invited speakers, starting with Barbara.
Yeah, thank you very much. I am a little confused right now. And before getting started, I need to ask a quick question, which I should have asked before when we were preparing, because I had as a topic, and because I didn't read the last emails and I got confused, that was about the transition transformation with respect to the state. But I can also switch quickly and talk about transition and transformation in general. This is what I have here.
No, well, whatever you've prepared, because
no.
As far as I
Because
understand, the concept of today is it naive? Is it revolutionary to believe that you know, how do we get from here to there? What are there positive signs? Do we see positive signs for degrowth future, or signs of co-optation?
Yeah.
These kinds of questions.
Okay, so then you know what? I'm going to just change what I was going to do because I think this fits better. And I must apologize to everyone who's listening now. It is because I have been traveling and all my plans have changed last minute. When you live across 2 continents and 3 countries, this happens. I was gonna
say, don't worry at all. We're very happy to have you here, and very happy to hear
okay,
your thoughts.
I'm excited to be here. It's been actually the topic that I want to talk about. Switching it quickly last minute, literally last minute, is very at the core of the confusion that you see in my face right now. I just finished one of the worst term of teaching in my life at my university. It was completely stressful. And this is part of what I want also to focus on in terms of talking about degrowth as transformation. I'm going to share a few things, but I'm going to move back and forth across a few slides, and some of which are already known to you if you have encountered me in other degrowth conversation or conferences. And so I will just share just a few images, and I will take it from there to start thinking in terms of transformation and transition. And then I look forward to enter into the conversation. So I'm going to stick to the 10 minutes. Let me just set it up so that I have a different set of slides here. And I also want to see you all. Okay, now I'm ready to go. You know, this is something that is probably very well known to you. It is from the degrowth vocabulary for a new era. I like to always refer to that to understand, to you know, to mind again to things probably about growth is not just the reversal of growth. When I moved to the United States 10 years ago, I remember that the word degrowth was frowned upon and looked at as something highly problematic. I know that it's very different in Canada. Also probably because of the long-term relationship to the French-speaking tradition and how the croissants in France is much older, has been discussed decades before the pivotal book by Tim Jackson was published in English that made degrowth a topic that was all of a sudden discussed also in the English-speaking world. But when I moved to the United States 10 years ago, I remember that people kept referring to degrowth as something that cannot be a catalyzer for transformation and radical change because it sounds so negative. And this is one of the things I want to focus on specifically today about the negative sounding of degrowth is exactly the power that is embedded in the degrowth narrative as radical alternative to neoliberalism and transformation. I want to show this to stress the importance of not degrowth as a reversal of what happens. Is not so much about reversing GDP, is not so much as thinking society without the growth of GDP, but is a critique that is way more radical than that and hits at the core the neoliberal restructuring of society that we have seen all over the world, starting in the 1980s in the United States and in England. So it's a radical narrative where the DE sounds for me in my ears more similarly to decolonization as is it's a narrative of liberation from something which is a structural addiction of our societies. I'm just moving quickly about growth. And again, these are things that are well known to you, but in many, many cases, the critique of growth mostly focus on GDP. And this is an old critique. Everyone knows the critique about GDP, or the critique of material growth. This is the kind of focus that mostly the dominant narrative about degrowth has been for a long time. It is no longer the case. I'm very happy to see that it has moved elsewhere, but I want to just bring this to mind to enter the conversation today. And this is relevant. It's not that it is not relevant. The critique of GDP as a measurement, of course, of the health of an economy is absurd. And I don't even have to go into the detail why it is absurd, because it measures only monetary transactions, and including those which reflect defensive costs, as we all know. But the core of the ecological critique to growth is about the material throughput. So the point about degrowth, and it's also in the official definition of degrowth, is about a just and sustainable reduction of the material throughput of a society. And I think this is essential. This is actually the goal of thinking degrowth as a normative goal. And what I want to say is not just on this. There is a lot of analysis that has been done, for example, by Peter Victor, and I'm speaking in York virtually, so I don't have to add anything about that, about also how to implement a potential transition to degrowth as a top-down model, focusing on degrowth as an alternative to monetary growth and material growth. I think this is absolutely important. But there are dimensions that for me are more central and more important, and where I do see that, I mean, more important, are just as important, and where I see that transition and transformation that degrowth embodies as more radical. First of all, this kind of social-cultural dimension, depending on the theoretical perspective you come from, you could use different narratives. I like to use the narrative articulated by the German sociologist Harald Welzer when he talked about growth as a mental infrastructure, because I think this is something we also have to consider. And I want to focus in particular on growth as a mental infrastructure as a modality of neoliberalism, where economic growth is not only about the material throughput of society, and is not only about more, but is also about better. And so I think that the narrative of better is just an enemy as the narrative of more under the framework of neoliberalism. And here you already can see provocatively why I consider that the negative sounding term of degrowth has a strong power as in opposition to the neoliberal narrative of constant self-improvement, self-enhancement, that leads to an over-exploitation of life and life energy. I will say just a few more about that when I talk briefly about the neoliberal restructuring of society. And the fourth dimension is growth as stabilizer of modern societies. And this is what makes the transition and transformation complicated, because growth has become this pivotal element that stabilizes modern capitalist society around itself. And many of you have already seen this picture, but whenever I speak about degrowth, I always show my hamster on the bicycle to represent what I mean when I talk about the structural role of growth. Modern capitalist society are like a crazy bicycle. Everyone knows a bicycle. If a bicycle stops moving, it falls. The crazy bicycle of modern capitalist society is a bicycle that has to keep accelerating in order not to fall down. And the narrative of growth is a narrative of constant acceleration and exponential increase and growth. So the stabilization of society is also stabilization of democracy. I actually do think that part of the crisis of democracies, of liberal democracies that we're observing all over the world, are related also to the impossibility of guaranteeing constant rates of GDP growth under the same condition as they were set up during the so-called period of Fordism right after the Second World War, in which economic growth was, thanks to the structure of society, led to a stabilization of democracy by guaranteeing the promise, the output legitimation of democracy, a certain level of equality for certain people, for the majority of people, without considering minorities, and also in a very gender-related division of labor that we all know. But it has worked that way, and that is the narrative that has stabilized so-called welfare democracies. And this is why just imagining of taking away growth without radically changing the structure of society is highly problematic. I don't go into all the details. I'm just really running fast here just to move into the transition transformation, but I want to frame that conversation under this perspective. We have entered a crisis of growth at the end of so-called Fordism in the 1970s. This was very well known by those in power, and was not just a narrative that came from environmental movements. What happened was not continuing business as usual, but was a radical transformation of societies, in particular societies of the global north. For the global south, a slightly different narrative should be articulated here. But sorry, I don't have the slides that I hope I had here, because I change quickly. But what happened with the neoliberal restructuring of society is really extracting value from life in all its form. And that includes our emotional life, our relational life, our creative life, and life literally, the life, from genetic modification to biopiracy and bioprospect. All the forms of life become the foundation for the creation of value, which is valorized and appropriated in a capitalistic framework. So the counter narrative of degrowth, and again, this is an image that I use very often when I construct this story, is a narrative of a different bicycle. What needs to do, the transformation that degrowth brings about has to be a transformation that tackles the frame of the bicycle, because we cannot maintain the same frame of the bicycle that we had before and take away growth, because what happens is what we're observing around. What happens is a dramatic crisis of democracy, a trajectory towards fascism and other forms of austerity, recession, and crisis that just the opposite of the problems that it attached to the narrative of degrowth. Talking about the radical the radical transformation of society, and I'm getting to the end of my time, I think degrowth challenged radically the very narrative of neoliberalism and its structure by unveiling exactly the story of better as something that kind of covers the story of more. So I really am I'm very strong about challenging the logic of better, not because improving is a bad thing, but because it's a dictate of better that has become the way in which we constantly increase our modality of self-exploitment in this society. And I think that transition and transformation have to operate simultaneously at 3 different levels. And I'm just finishing here, and then in the discussion, we can go into more details thinking about these 3 different levels. One is the structural and institutional level, rethinking and democratizing economic relations, for example. And here is feminist contribution, feminist ecological economics contribution has been always extremely helpful in rethinking the way of restructuring time and time distribution in society, for example. Rethink innovation and technologies, and there are movements within degrowth that go towards the global new commons movement and new technology that serve communities instead of addicting communities to them and being addicted to growth. What I think is essential is a radical transformation of the social imaginary. And here, and we can go back to that in the conversation, I think that a radical transformation of the social imaginary requires a transformation of experience. And we need spaces in which we can experience and experiment with the possibility of living otherwise. And this part of the radical alternative to the neoliberal mental infrastructure that can only change if you start changing our habits and practices. So the social imaginary and the collective practices are intimately connected. I don't believe that it is necessary to upscale social experiments. I think that the trajectory is a trajectory of alliances across social experiments that are happening all over the world, in particular also in the global south, where alternative ways and modes of living are made possible. But in the global north, where the modality of neoliberalism really operates as a mental infrastructure, these are spaces in which we can actually experience in our bodies, in the emotional dimension of our bodies, what it means to live otherwise. And my last thought that I want to give you here, and for this I'm going to even stop sharing, is that I think there is a lot that we can learn from, to look, for example, into queer strategies, because similarly, the pervasive dimension of heteronormativity doesn't leave space for the visibility of alternative ways of living. So I think that queer strategies have always embodied this modality of challenging a system that is completely pervasive, similarly to neoliberalism. So I wonder whether we can, as a component, is not all of it, as I said, it's just the dimension of practices and imaginaries. Where can we start challenge and embody alternative practices in collective social experiments that enable us to start imagine and think as ourselves otherwise and embody relations otherwise? And again, I think there is a lot that can be also learned from the queer movement. If it was a little chaotic, I apologize. It was really last-minute improvisation, but I look forward to going to the discussion later, and I'm very, very happy about the comments, and I'm going to read them right now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Barbara, for that spontaneous and simultaneously very well organized set of thoughts and provocations. And now I think we can turn it over to Hubert.
Thank you so much. I'll try to share my screen here. Does that look okay? Okay, so first of all, thank you so much for initiating this seminar series. It's a really wonderful idea, and I'm so grateful to have been invited to say a few words about my perspective on degrowth. Thank you also to everyone here for taking the time to be here. I really sincerely appreciate it, and I very much look forward to discussing degrowth transformations with you. It's something I've been doing research on for the past, I don't know, 12 years or so. So it's definitely a topic close to my heart. So in this very brief talk, I will try to loosely respond to the questions that were posed either directly or indirectly by the organizers of the session. And those are big questions. So questions like, what are we aiming for with the degrowth transformations? Would degrowth be revolutionary? What are the pathways there? What are the main obstacles? And is degrowth naive? My responses to these questions will obviously be superficial, but I hope we can discuss some of them further during the Q&A. And also I would say that most of the questions are addressed at greater length in the aforementioned book that I've recently published with Jana Nesterova and Max Koch. It's a book that you can access free of charge from the website that I've listed here, manchesterhive.com. So if we start with the aim of degrowth, ultimately, as I see it, the aim of degrowth transformations is to restore or create harmony in the world. So in my work with Jana Nesterova, I've suggested that degrowth to this end entails transformations in 4 dimensions of our existence. In each of these dimensions, we have to move towards having less of what characterizes contemporary capitalist societies and towards more of other things. The dimensions are our relations with nature or planetary boundaries, its social relations, its social structures, and the psyche. So in this view, degrowth, for example, entails that we get cleaner energy form, that we get regard for planetary boundaries, that we get more nature-based economic activities. In terms of our social relations, how we interact with one another, we need more empathy, more compassion, more sufficiency, kindness, tolerance of diversity. In terms of social structures, we need more collaboration, more equal distribution of economic and other resources. We need more flat hierarchies. And then finally, as regards the psyche or our inner being as human beings, we need more love, more creativity, more gentleness towards being and beings. So that is what degrowth entails more of. At the same time, it entails less of exactly the opposite things that I just mentioned here. So this is to say that degrowth is as much about growth as it is about reduction. But of course, it's about a very different type of growth than that currently pursued in capitalist societies. Would degrowth then be revolutionary? Well, I'm a bit conflicted as to how to answer this question. On one hand, yes, degrowth would be revolutionary in the sense that it entails deep transformations, bringing about very different societies, transformations the like of which we have never seen previously in human history. Prefiguring degrowth in everyday life may also be considered revolutionary. So in my own life, I try to live consistently with degrowth values. So my partner and I lead a minimalist lifestyle. We own very few things. We don't have a car, we don't have a TV, we don't have paintings, we don't have much furniture. We try to live slowly, we try to live simply, we rarely travel, we go to few conferences, so on and so forth. And I think some people at least would think that this way of living is quite revolutionary compared to how most middle-class folks live. At the same time, degrowth would not be revolutionary in the sense of being a swift, let alone violent transformation. So degrowth would need to happen peacefully via democratic channels. Also, degrowth would not be revolutionary in the sense of changing everything completely. All the things that degrowth entails more of, that is, all the things I showed in the table just before, are things that already exist. Some of them exist in the niches of society, which is where degrowth is currently emanating from. So degrowth, it builds on what is already in existence. In that sense, it's not revolutionary. What then are the pathways? Well, these years there's much discussion over the mechanisms that can bring about degrowth. In the book, we argue that for degrowth to materialize on a societal scale, transformations are required that are so comprehensive that no single actor, no single type of process, no single type of mechanism will suffice to bring it about. Degrowth, one thing, requires state action in the form of various degrowth policies or eco-social policies, something that was addressed in the previous seminar of this series. That would be policies such as caps on wealth and income combined with universal basic income and certain universal basic services. It could also be limits placed on certain modes of transportation, regulation to end production of unnecessary goods and services, and much more than that. Degrowth also requires actions from businesses, and it requires actions from movements in the civil society that can put pressure on states to adopt the necessary policies. But then importantly, degrowth also requires each of us to implement degrowth compatible lifestyles in our everyday lives. For degrowth to materialize, in other words, activities of agents positioned everywhere are required. So it's not just the responsibility of, say, policymakers or activists or degrowth academics. It's the responsibility of each and every one of us. So why is degrowth not materializing, one might ask? At least it's not materializing on a societal scale. That is a big question that I can only sort of give a partial answer to here. But back in 2018, I published an analysis of this question where I identified 4 prerequisites for a degrowth paradigm shift. The prerequisites are a deep crisis of the current system, a political project pointing beyond the crisis, a comprehensive coalition of social forces with sufficient power and resources, and finally, public support or at least consent. if we start with the first prerequisite, it's safe to say that we live in a crisis period at the moment. So I think we can check that one off. The second prerequisite, the existence of a political project that points a way out of the crisis, can also be checked off, because while Degrowth is not a fully developed political project, it still provides a general vision pointing beyond the major crises of our time, a vision that is accompanied by at least a discussion of policies and initiatives that can materialize this vision. So I would say that Degrowth, among other things, is a diverse political project. Then we have the third prerequisite for Degrowth transformations, namely a coalition with the means needed for the project to come to shape societal developments. And no such coalition exists behind the Degrowth project at the moment. The primary advocates of Degrowth are grassroots, small fractions of left-wing parties, a growing number of academics, and concerned citizens. Yet Degrowth transitions on national or international scale, they would require a massive mobilization in civil society. And as long as that mobilization is missing, Degrowth transformations will not happen. And then we have the final prerequisite, which is public support for, or at least consent to, the overall Degrowth vision. There are some indications that growth critical ideas are on the rise, yet most people probably still haven't heard about Degrowth, and if they were to hear about it, I think it's questionable if they would find it attractive. It's questionable whether they would want to move towards a system in which they would have to consume less and differently. So these, at least in my analysis, are two of the main obstacles to Degrowth transformations. In addition to them, there are many other obstacles, many of them being place-specific obstacles, but that's probably the topic of a different lecture. So in conclusion, is Degrowth naive? Well, it would be naive to think that Degrowth is very likely to happen. After all, only two of the four prerequisites for Degrowth transition that I identified before currently exist. But also I would say that in my experience, people in Degrowth circles are not this naive. They do understand well that the pathway to Degrowth is paved with obstacles. They do understand that the odds are not particularly good. I think it was the ecological economist Herman Daly who once said something along the lines that he would rather believe in something that is politically impossible than in something that is biophysically impossible. And this is also a bit how I feel about Degrowth. I'm well aware that for most political parties, it would currently be political suicide to advocate Degrowth policies. And yet what they are currently pursuing is ultimately biophysically impossible. So that is really the great paradox of our times. While politically infeasible at the moment, pursuing Degrowth is, in my opinion, to be serious about the situation we are in. And to me, the overall ideas in Degrowth are good, they're beautiful, they are worth fighting for, and they are worth living in accordance with, even if you do so imperfectly. And that is also to say that, seen from my perspective, Degrowth transformations, they start with ourselves. They start with our own practices rather than somewhere else. So I think that was what I had on my mind. Thanks.
Well, thank you both very much. And your comments, your talks have generated at least 9 questions. So I think I'll try to organize them. In fact, there's one question that I think we can ask sort of together, because Phoebe asks, which countries are voluntarily attempting degrowth in some form or are most interested to look at on the topic? As well, Nandini asked, are there any examples of degrowth happening in society at large or small scales? So I think both of those questions are very much the same question. So why don't we? Do you both want to tackle that? and Barbara first, and then Hubert. So we're looking for examples of degrowth.
I don't see any. If we're talking about a macropolitical structure, a macroeconomic and macropolitical structure of degrowth. And I don't see any for the reason I have mentioned before. Because when I say our, I would have to specify when I talk about modern capitalistic societies, are fundamentally revolving around growth as its main stabilization factor, although they are also already moving away from that. And this is the dangerous part of it. I think that what Hubert has very rightly articulated, it cannot be, no political coalition would find itself around degrowth as a political goal to reach. Precisely because that comes with a series of consequences that are unavoidable. And I want to very briefly say a little bit about that. But before that, I think that there is another way of thinking degrowth, not as a political goal, not as a normative goal. Not that it is wrong to think it in those terms. Again, I want to be intentionally provocative for the conversation here too. We always talk about degrowth as something we ought to do, we should do. It's similarly to sustainability as a goal to reach. I'm thinking in a provocative way as degrowth as a way to save societies. If we don't do anything, in other words, as growth is no longer possible in the same way, and if it is possible, it has become a goal in itself, and it does not bring about all those promises for the majority of society that has brought about during the Fordistic era. It just goes on like that. The business as usual is a business as usual narrative that has been very well depicted by right-wings degrowth supporters, because they exist. We don't have them in the degrowth movement, but they exist, they're out there, and they are publishing. And for them, they use, I think, erroneously the word degrowth, which I don't think is intended that way, but it's basically the fallen bicycle. So it is a society governed by austerity policy in which we go back to traditional gender roles. Even in the more kind of fascist narrative of that, we talk about we talk about communities that are not just they're culturally homogeneous and therefore, in other words, bluntly racist, etc. So this is the narratives out there, and I think that is one fairly likely scenario, rather than the neoliberal. And neoliberalism is also going into an authoritarian version of it. So for me, degrowth could become a point of encounter for politics, not so much in terms of let's bring it about like we talked about sustainable development or sustainability, but let's start reimagining how we can conceive a society that is basically just and no longer dependent on economic growth, because the left has not done any thinking about that, because growth has always been the answer for good reasons, structural reason. I don't want to advocate for them. So I think this might be a different shift in the narrative, and this is why I don't see examples of that happening. I see not nations, but I see examples of that happening in project communities. Someone has also brought up Gibson Graham, post-capitalist economists, and this is a list of examples that happen in the pockets of a system which is never entirely pervasive, luckily, right? So that is actually happening out there, and it's happening mostly in other parts of the world, and which are already connected and linked in alliance with one another, but not at the level of a nation state. Also, we might think of even more radically than that, because we might think going in a direction in which we no longer have the structure of nation states, but this is going maybe too far. That much for now.
Hubert.
Yeah, thanks so much for this wonderful question. And I mean, I do agree with Barbara. I also cannot think of examples of degrowth being pursued at the level of any nation state or any country. But I think that being said, degrowth is something that is being pursued within probably most countries by various movements. So implicitly, there are degrowth compatible movements such as voluntary simplicity. There's the tiny house movement. There's the zero waste movement. And although they don't bear the name of degrowth, I think they have many commonalities with degrowth. They share many values with it. So I'm quite inspired by feminists, Gibson Graham and their diverse economies perspective that sort of note that, yeah, we have capitalism, but we also have all sorts of other things happening around capitalism. There are all sorts of non-capitalist organizations, all sorts of non-capitalist practices taking place, and this is really what I think. This is really why we see degrowth in action these years, even if it doesn't necessarily happen under that label of degrowth. It's not a full answer, I know, to the question, or maybe it is, but that's what came to mind.
Thank you for those answers. It seems you've answered Saye's question about Gibson Graham. There's one that I think is very polarizing that I think would be an interesting one from Christoph. Christoph says, degrowth discourse is regularly structured in a way that avoids addressing the very obvious sacrifices it entails. I believe that this voluntary oversight limits its political potential and its capacity to mobilize citizens, but I'd be interested to hear your opinion on this. Shall we go Hubert and then Barbara this time?
I think it's precisely right. I mean, I think it's a really good comment. I think there is a tendency, not only in the degrowth literature, but also in some of the related literatures, for example, the literature on the well-being economy, to make these sustainability transitions sound as if they are going to be some sort of wellness retreat characterized by comfort and happiness, when really what we're talking about in degrowth is something that would, at some point, I think, increase well-being of the vast majority of people. But in the short term, it would involve sacrifices. It would involve people having to give up many of the currently harmful practices, certainly people in the middle and upper classes. And I think that's also, yeah, I mean, we can discuss the concept of a degrowth, and it has been discussed to no end for 10 years. I actually, like Barbara, like that concept quite a bit, because I think it marks some sort of opposition. But I think the reason why people don't like degrowth, it's not because of the label of degrowth, it's because the content of degrowth is quite controversial. It's quite radical if you think about it in relation to how most people live their lives currently. So yeah, I don't know. At least that's a beginning of an answer. Maybe Barbara will want to take over or disagree with what I just said there.
No, I do not. In fact, I think this is a very, very important point to bring up. I remember the last 5 years, I was mostly busy with working in this IPES assessment on the multiple values of nature. I have neglected the degrowth debate, and now I'm coming back to it. Finally, that has been finished. So I have so much to read about what has been published recently. But before going into that kind of closed box, I remember one of the leading conversation about degrowth was that degrowth was promising happiness to everyone, and a good life for all, and working less. And there is all this very famous publication by Yorgos Kallis about Fridays off. I remember, I don't know whether you're familiar with this very beautiful 4-minute video by I forgot the name now. It was published by Grits about the degrowth, and it's a funny video that represents it as a narrative of happiness. And there is something important to it. I think there can be also a narrative of a different way of understanding a good life. The key point is that the shadow of it has not been addressed enough, and is one of the reasons why still today workers' unions are skeptical. Some of them are entering the conversation, but the majority of workers' unions are skeptical about the degrowth narrative, not because they're just antique. In some ways they are, and they want to maintain their power, but they are also analyzing something which is very important to consider. And it is that implementing degrowth will eventually lead to consequences that are not necessarily in terms of happiness or a good life for all, but for some and not for others. So I think this the conflictual dimension needs to be articulated more, even especially on a global level. If we talk about global north and global south, I think it's important to consider also that there is a necessary sacrifice that the global north has to make, because all of the wonderful narrative during Fordism and the relative prosperity of countries of the global north were fundamentally parasitic on neocolonialism and on the global south, as we know, right? So it's hard to articulate that, because that will hit, and I appreciate that Hubert mentioned the middle classes, because these are the ones that will be hit the most, not only materially, but because they are already hit materially. We're already there, actually. This is actually happening, but in their imaginaries and the promise attached to their self-identity and self-identification. So this is where I think that constructing a different imaginary would be essential at this place, because what happens when the middle classes feel like they are left out is what we're observing. We have fascism on the rise everywhere. So this is very dangerous. But I want to say both, right? Yes, there is sacrifices to be made, because the model of prosperity was a parasitic model, not only on the global south, but thinking of how that was designed and conceived. It was a model of prosperity based on a certain gender division of labor, a certain division of labor across periphery centers and peripheries within global north and global south. Here, I really think that, for example, the narrative of authors like thinkers like Uli Brandt and Marcus Wissen about the imperial mode of living are essential when you consider that the mode of living, that prosperity mode of living, is imperialistic and parasitic. And this is where degrowth challenges that mode of living. But that can also open up a completely different promise for a good life under a different narrative. So I think this is the challenge, right? It's not just sacrifice, but it's shifting to a dimension that is, for example, a dimension of slowing down, stopping accelerating, resisting self-exploitation, resisting also the narrative of better for some who might react to that, not for, and again, depending on the classes in society, etc. Sorry, I'm speaking too long, I'm shutting up.
No, people came to hear what you think. I think we should, here's another provocative one. Is there an alternative, Radko asks, to degrowth when trying to solve the poly crisis? So Barbara first and then Hubert. Is there an alternative to degrowth?
There are millions of alternatives. I don't know whether there are alternatives, but this is also, I think degrowth is a useful umbrella for alliances across different ways of thinking how we live together, successfully articulated in Europe. I also think that there have always been alternative way of reacting and fighting and struggling and rethinking. And the place to go for that is the global tapestry of alternative, which was, by the way, created as a global alliance during the South-North Degrowth Conference in Mexico City in 2018. That is a wonderful place of global South-South alliances, where I follow Uli Brandt in saying that there is a global South in the global North and a global North in the global South. So it's not just geographical, but and that is a beautiful place. There are many alternatives there. That embody also different imaginaries and narratives, but they can be allied and construct alliances with degrowth. I think the question wanted to go in a different direction. So I also want to say that I don't think there is an alternative to degrowth, because the alternative is what we're already heading towards. I mean, the alternative exists and it's the business as usual. This for me is authoritarian neoliberalism. So I think in that sense, there is no alternative in the old narrative of Castoriadis, right? Socialism or barbarism. But I think in this case, is degrowth or that trajectory. But so I want to play with alternatives in the both senses of the term.
Yeah, I mean, I can only second that. I think there is no alternative to degrowth. The alternative is an eco-social collapse, to put it bluntly. Then, of course, you have various schools of thought or various perspectives or discourses that are somewhat similar or related to degrowth, the well-being economy, post-growth economics, the donut economy. Those kind of perspectives, and maybe they also have some of the answers, but in some respects, I think they overlap with degrowth. So I think for me, I don't see so many other sort of good options on the table, to be honest. I think we need degrowth. I've yet to be convinced by sort of hearing about alternatives to degrowth that could work out.
Thank you. I think we have time for one or two more. Why don't we try Land's question? Does degrowth imply a stronger role of religions because it encourages non-material based happiness, which also includes spirituality? Hubert and then Barbara.
Well, I'm not a religious person myself, so I think I'm probably not really well placed to to answer this question. And I know that the Pope came out in favor of degrowth some years ago, at least some version of degrowth, which could maybe suggest that there could be this sort of connection. And I do think, at least in my own work with Jana that I mentioned previously, we do place a lot of emphasis on inner transformation. Sort of having these sort of senses of awe, of wonder, of oneness with nature and the universe, and I think some people can definitely achieve that through religious thinking, but it's not really a big part, I have to admit, of my own thinking about degrowth. So I think it's probably for other people to to answer that question better than I can.
Provocative question is which religion, because there are ways in which a certain narrative, and not what you mentioned, Hubert, is not against what you said, but there is a certain way in which mindfulness and Eastern religions are being appropriated in a neoliberal narrative. So there is that narrative, but it is actually in order to improve yourself. It is in the self-enhancement narrative. There is a way in which a certain version of evangelicalism is completely in tune with a narrative of expansion, appropriation, conquer, and even as a justification of a certain modality and form of capitalism. So I mean, again, yes, the Pope in Laudato Si has explicitly referred to degrowth. Actually, it's interesting that the translation into English does not mention the word degrowth, but if you look into the Spanish and the Italian, this is the word used. So I find it also interesting. There has been even a taming of the encyclical by the Pope. So there is a reference to that. But again, there are many stories here. I'm hearing that. I grew up Catholic myself. I live in the US. I have friends who are from various tribes in the Pacific Northwest, and I'm really working to bring back to the table the doctrine of discovery and how the whole justification of the genocide of First Nations is imbued is a religious narrative of Christians versus pagans. So again, religion is an incredible force for challenging social imaginaries, but religion is also not a neutral force. It's imbued with power and has different way of being allied with certain forces. And so this is why I think religion can become a force for change in this direction or not, depending on the alliances with which forces out there.
Okay, I think it's 1:26, so maybe the last question will be from Ellie Perkins in the chat. Our colleague Ellie, who works on some of these questions too, Ellie asks, coming back to Hubert's first prerequisite, a deep crisis, could it be that the phase of sacrifice and across-the-board deprivation might take care of the difficult and unpopular resource stripping, so that if a nascent degrowth pilot projects, and imaginaries are there to be mobilized and built upon, I think it's the definite article that gave me trouble. So that if nascent degrowth pilot projects and imaginaries are there to be mobilized and built upon, they could appear as attractive alternatives for a new equitable future. So if there's a crisis that causes all this deprivation, maybe it would be only upward from there, and degrowth could take their spot on the historical stage at that point. Do you want to tackle that, Barbara, and then Hubert? And then,
yeah, I briefly answered in the chat already. I agree with Ellie. I think that there is in every crisis, there is a chance, and this is part of what I said before, to not necessarily think degrowth as an ought-to normative goal, but as a way of answering to the crisis, which is a better way of answering to the crisis instead of a business as usual answer. And that can be appealing to many people. Instead, but that it also means that the voices embodying a degrowth transition have to be different ones, because right now the voices embodying a digital transition are still relatively well situated, middle class, LOHAS, the lifestyle of health and sustainability type of. It is changing, and this is where the global progressive alternative is a more interesting, wider perspective there. But I think that it has, the narrative needs to move away from a narrative of a green transition as a goal, as the traditional narrative embodied by the various green parties, and it has to become a different narrative that is a narrative of how do we save our societies. It's not just a green narrative. Again, not because the green narrative is not a good one, but I think there is a potential there to make it into a meaningful and appealing answer to the deep crisis. Crisis, I like to use the plural here.
I think it's a wonderful comment, and it's one that I need to give some more thought, I think. But I think in terms of degrowth, I think I would like to end on the note of emphasizing the need to frame it more positively. So I think degrowth as a concept, it emphasizes only the negative. It emphasizes what needs to be reduced, what we need to shrink, what we need to have less of. But at the same time, degrowth is really about growth in all sorts of things that I think many people would actually like to have more of. So I think there is I think a point in emphasizing that more in going forward, because I think the degrowth discourse has been quite negative. It needs to be critical, obviously, of capitalism. I'm extremely critical of it myself, but I think the degrowth is also about offering something beautiful, some beautiful alternative. And I think that's something I would like to talk more about in the coming years, growth in degrowth, the things that we need to have more of that already exist and that we can build on. And also I would like to talk more about how we get from where we are right now. So how do we get from the concrete societies that already exist, that people they live in. Those societies, they are extremely different. We don't start out from the same starting point, all of us. Denmark is completely different from Italy, which is completely different from Canada. And each country has different niches, different traditions that we can build on to bring about degrowth or sustainable societies. And I think that's what we should talk about. I think degrowth should not be about sort of painting beautiful pictures of some future. It should be about where we are now as individuals and societies, what we can build on positively, what we can grow in ourselves and in societies. Yeah.
Can I just, a very brief comment here is that I think that negative narrative is very much into the English speaking way in which degrowth has been just taken on. The original debate that starts in the 70s and then pops up back in the 90s in French, Spanish, and Italian had this dimension of liberation, of decolonization. The word is decolonization is problematic, and I know it, but how Latour used it as decolonization of the imaginary, in the sense of liberation from a neoliberal imaginary. I think that part has got a little lost when it, lost in translation, when the dominant English-speaking narrative is taken on the Degrow movement and made it more universal, probably more global in many ways, right? But
Well, thank you all very much. Truly engaged audience. We didn't even get to all of the questions, but I think we got to many of the good ones. Thank you for your provocations at the beginning to Barbara and Hubert. And it's difficult to summarize this, but I think we did address the question that we the challenge that we had to take up in terms of how to get from here to there. I don't know, Lena, do you want to add anything? I think
yeah, if you allow me 1 minute, I've got some quick closing remarks since this is the last session of the series. So yeah, I would like to end the session today by thanking all our speakers and moderators. So of course, Barbara, Hubert, and Justin, but all of our speakers and moderators throughout the series. Also the over 600 people who at some point registered for the sessions and the many who have watched the recordings. Together, we have discussed a wide range of topics, starting with the social and ecological justification for degrowth, followed by feminist and decolonial synergies with and challenges to degrowth, an exploration of degrowth implications for cities and planning, the relationship between degrowth and technology, the role of the state in a degrowth future, and of course, today's topic on a transition and transformation to degrowth. Just to say that the origins for the seminar series come out from the curiosity of 3 students, Kelly, Elaine, and Anna, who you can see here with their cameras on. They reached out to me to study degrowth in depth. This led to a wonderful working relationship where we have inspired and learned from each other. And then to finish in the context of today's session and the context of the series as a whole, it is their passion for a truly different and better world that gives me hope for a degrowth future. So thank you, everyone, and hopefully we can continue these conversations somewhere, somehow.
thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Kelly, do you want to stop the recording?